Can we talk about the mind of Vladimir Putin? You've mentioned that this idea that he has aspirations for imperialist conquest, that he dreams of empire, is not grounded in reality. He wrote an essay in 2021 about one people. Do you think there is some degree to which he still dreams of the former Soviet Union reuniting?
No. He's made it clear that anybody with a triple-digit IQ understands that it's nuts to think about recreating the Soviet Union. He thinks it's a tragedy that the Soviet Union fell apart. Mm-hmm. But as he made clear in that essay, the July 12th, 2021 essay, and as he made clear in speeches immediately before he invaded Ukraine, he accepted the breakup of the Soviet Union, and he accepted the status quo in Europe, save for the fact he did not accept the idea that Ukraine would become part of NATO.
He's been in power for over 2 decades. Is there a degree that power can affect a leader's ability to see the world clearly? As they say, corrupt. Do you think power has corrupted Vladimir Putin to a degree?
It's very hard for me to answer that question because I don't know him and I've not studied him carefully in terms of his overall performance over the course of, the 23 years that he's been in power. I've studied him as a strategist, and I've studied how he, deals with the West, and deals with the international system more generally since 2014. And I think he is a first-class strategist. This is not to say he doesn't make mistakes, and he admits he's made some mistakes. But I think that the West is dealing with a formidable adversary here. And I don't see any evidence that he's either lost speed off his fastball or that power has corrupted his thinking about strategic affairs.
So he has consistently put as a primary concern security, as does the United States. He's put for Russia's security, making sure that NATO doesn't get close to its borders.
I think that's clear, yeah. I think, as I emphasized early on in our conversation, that leaders privilege security or survival over everything else. And by the way, he gave a number of talks and press conferences in addition to writing that famous article that you referred to on July 12, 2021. So we have, a pretty clear record of what he was saying, and I would argue what he was thinking in the run-up to the war in February 2022. And if you read what he said, it's quite clear that he privileged security or survival. He was deeply concerned about the security of Russia. And Russia is a quite vulnerable state in a lot of ways, especially if you think back to what it looked like in the 1990s, as you know better than I do. It was in terrible shape. The Chinese talk about the century of national humiliation. One could argue that for the Russians, that was the decade of national humiliation. And it took Putin, I think, quite a bit of time to bring the Russians back from the dead. I think he eventually succeeded, but it took a considerable amount of time. And I think he understood that he was not playing a particularly strong hand. He was playing something of a weak hand. And he had to be very careful, very cautious. And I think he was. And I think that's very different than the United States. The United States was the unipole. It was the most powerful state in the history of the world, most powerful state relative to all its possible competitors from, roughly 1989, certainly after December 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, up until, I would argue, about 2017. We were incredibly powerful. And even after 2017, up to today, the United States remains the most powerful state in the system. And because of our geographical location, we are in a terrific situation to survive in any great power competition. So you have a situation involving the United States that's different than the situation involving Russia. They're just much more vulnerable than we are. And therefore, I think Putin tends to be more sensitive about security than any American president in recent times.
Europe on one side, China on the other side. It's a complicated situation.
Yeah, and we talked before about 1812 when Napoleon invaded and Moscow got burned to the ground. Mm-hmm. We talked about World War I, where the Russians were actually defeated and surrendered. And then we talked about 1941 to 1945, where although thankfully the Soviets prevailed, it was a close call. And I mean, the casualties, the destruction that the Soviet Union had inflicted on it by the Germans is just almost hard to believe. So they are sensitive. You can understand full well, or at least you should be able to understand full well, why the idea of bringing Ukraine up to their border really spooked them. I don't understand why more Americans don't understand that. It befuddles me. I think it has to do with the fact that Americans are not very good in putting themselves in the shoes of other countries. You really, if you're going to be a first-class strategist in international politics, you have to be able to do that. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the other side and think about how they think, so you don't make foolish mistakes.
And as a starting point, Americans tend to see themselves as the good guys and a set of others as the bad guys. And you have to be able to empathize that Russians think of themselves as the good guys. The Chinese think of themselves as the good guys. And just be able to empathize. If they are the good guys, it's like that funny skit, Are We the Baddies? Consider the United States could be the bad guys. Like, first of all, see the world, if the United States is the bad guys and China is the good guys, what does that world look like? Be able to just exist with that thought, because that is what the Chinese leadership and many Chinese citizens, if not now, maybe in the future, will believe. And you have to kind of do the calculation, the simulation forward from that. And same with Russia, same with other nations.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And just, I always think of Michael McFaul at Stanford, who was the American ambassador to Russia, I think between 2012 and 2014. And he told me that he told Putin that Putin didn't have to worry about NATO expansion because the United States was a benign hegemon. And I asked Mike what Putin's response was to that. And Mike said that Putin didn't believe it. But Mike believed that he should believe it, and that we could move NATO eastward to include Ukraine. And in the end, we'd get away with it because we are a benign hegemon. But the fact is, that's not what Putin saw. Putin saw us as a malign hegemon. And what Mike thinks or any American thinks doesn't matter. What matters is what Putin thinks.
But also, the drums of war have been beating for some reason. NATO expansion has been threatened for some reason. So you've talked about NATO expansion being dead. So it doesn't make sense from a geopolitical perspective on the Europe side to expand NATO. But nevertheless, that threat has been echoed. So why has NATO expansion been pushed from your perspective?
There are two reasons. One is, first of all, we thought it was a wonderful thing to bring more and more countries into NATO. We thought that it facilitated peace and prosperity. It was ultimately all for the good. Mm-hmm. And we also thought that countries like Ukraine had a right to join NATO. These are sovereign countries that can decide for themselves, and the Russians have no say in what Ukraine wants to do. And then finally, and this is a point I emphasized before, we were very powerful and we thought we could shove it down their throat. So it's a combination of those factors that led us to pursue what I think was ultimately a foolish policy.